at Expedia, and I have been involved with this information architecture, system architecture field for last 15-20 years. I'm very excited to share this information with you. So hopefully at the end of this session, we will be able to talk a little more about what is information architecture and how it relates to the computation. I'm going to start with a caveat. This is an overview. The keyword is an overview, so we are not going to go into the details, but we will scratch the surface. We will talk about the common terms and the common concepts, also how it relates to other architecture areas, and I think that perspective is more important from your perspective. So let's start with the high-level agenda. Why information is important. We will talk a little bit in terms of information and beyond. Then the core topic will be about the data transforming into information. So what are the processes when data becomes information, and some of the challenges related to it, like data quality issues, auditability issues. Once the information is derived, then obviously you need to manage it. So who are the people, which are the processes, which are the tools, and what is the context? And then finally, as I mentioned, I will wrap up with, now we have talked enough about information architecture. Let's come back to what it means from this competition perspective. So at a higher level, these are the main topics that we will be focusing on today. I hope at the end of the session, we will have enough time for Q&A, and I think that will be an appropriate time for questions, open discussions. However, during these slides or these topics, if you want to stop me and ask a specific question, Rakesh will coordinate that. So
if you have any questions, just type it in the question tab, and then I'll read it, and then Shikhar can answer that question.
Perfect. Okay. So starting with why information is important, to me, this is essentially a redundant question. If you ask 10 people, I don't think anybody will disagree that information is important, but probably the discussion will soon move on to some of the topics in terms of who should get this information, what is the right timing to get that information, who can act on this information. So as you can see, the question quickly transforms into, oh, we agree information is important. However, let's then talk about specifics. And that's why this is a leading question, and I really do not think that there will be people who believe that information is not important. So excuse my title, but it was essentially a redundant question leading to, we know that information translates into so many things, and I have just listed a couple of them, which I think we can look into. Information is definitely power. So as higher you go up in an organization, you start dealing with important, sensitive, and key information, what we call as strategic information. And then obviously with that comes more responsibility, accountability. So power, both in terms of organization level power, and also in terms of the influence, is important. Information is also a differentiator. So somebody who is having information and somebody not having information, there is a huge gap between these two. A classic example, we all know that If I want to search something, the very first thing comes to my mind is Google. Why? Because probably Google knows everything, right? So Google has that information. It is relevant information. I'm used to Google's interface and I can rely on Google. So almost searching any information, I pivot to Google. Same way we can, extrapolate that. If you want to go for e-commerce, probably Amazon is the place. So smartphones, probably Apple is the place. So as you can see, these are the companies or products which have taken information to the next level, and information is the key differentiator. Of course, information can also translate to money, barring the inside trading scenario. But if I know XYZ company is going to do good, obviously I can buy the stocks, I can make money. Everybody can list at least 5 or 10 other examples related to this. I just wanted this as a piece that we go to what it means to an organization. So on the right hand side, I have some of the information flows or some of the information needs related to an organization, whether it's a strategic planning, whether it's understanding the customer, or even targeting some of the customer. Information is the key, and it's the important glue that you want with you. So now that we know information is critical, do we stop at information? And unfortunately, the answer is no. As you can see, information is just the beginning. And what I mean by that is, many of you might have heard about Maslow's hierarchy needs. So Maslow was a scientist who studied the human needs. We all have some basic needs like food, shelter, safety. But once these basic needs are met, we want higher level of needs. That is the socialization needs, somebody appreciating us, somebody recognizing it. Similar to Maslow's need hierarchy, there is a hierarchy in the data world. Many of you may already be familiar with these concepts, but I just want to kind of bring it to the forefront and share it with the context. So data is everywhere. I mean, you look around, you can see examples of data, your smartphones, computers, books, everything is data. What differentiates data and information? And that is a key topic that we will be spending some amount of time, and we will be going through some of the examples. But at the same time, there are higher constructs than information. Many of you may already know and will be talking about, like artificial intelligence, machine learning, and things related to that. To me, those fit into what is packaged as knowledge. So when you compose information in a consumable format and it becomes knowledge, you can act on it, and it gives you that strategic advantage or actionable information, and then key edge that we talked earlier. But probably the final piece in the pyramid or the puzzle is often what is called as wisdom. And wisdom is something which is rare, which is universally accepted, and very few people possess it. So let's kind of go back and try to compare this with a real life example. So one of the things comes to my mind is, again, the stock market scenario. When you visit CNN, FN, or any of these websites that have stock information, they have last 5 years data about a company, how many stocks, who owns what. You start at the lowest level. Probably it's the data. If you are good enough in terms of connecting some of that information and translating into, is this company doing good, bad, what are the prospects for next 3 or 5 years? That's when you start getting into an information phase related to that. So these are the people who are essentially long-term investors, who are investing in 401k, or who are buying stocks on occasional basis. Then you start crossing that borderline between the information and knowledge, where there are stockbrokers and there are daytime traders. Those are the people who are essentially figured out the system in terms of how they can use the information to maybe earn their daily livelihood, or even make some money. That's where information starts crossing the border and moving into the knowledge arena. And then you always have somebody like Warren Buffett who has figured out the system. Everybody looks at him in terms of either he has some magic or he has figured out the formula, but he has a history of picking up the winners and making money out of stocks. And to me, probably he is in that wisdom category. So as you can see, as we move from data information upwards, it really starts synthesizing and transforming information into what it means and how it means. Now, this is a very kind of crude example, but I just wanted to kind of illustrate different levels, and then how different levels mean in terms of either day-to-day life, or even in terms of organization. Same way, I would say the earlier examples that we talked about, like Googles of the world, Amazons of the world, are moving away from information. Information is more or less given. They want to now start playing in the knowledge arena, or even in the wisdom arena. And that's why, even though our today's topic is information architecture, I just wanted to make sure that we also talk about this hierarchy and the concept of information and beyond. So I will take a pause. Another example which comes to my mind is, even in the education world, you always have a hierarchy of lecturers, professors, people who have done PhDs, but at the same time, there are people who are Nobel laureates or Einsteins of the world and Edisons of the world. And that is where also these guys have not only perfected information, but they have transformed the information into something called wisdom.
So Shekhar, we have two questions. Both are from Smriti. Her first question is, when raw data is pre-processed, we get information or knowledge? That's the question.
So the first step is always information, and we will talk about transforming data into information. That process, I have a later slide, we will go into that. Usually, you have to go through a step called information. Synthesizing the information and connecting the dot takes you to the next level, which is often called as knowledge.
Okay, and then other question is, let me rephrase a little bit, is wisdom when we generate insights after performing machine learning models on our pre-processed data?
Yeah, so I will not trivialize wisdom. Wisdom is really rare, and wisdom is something entire world has to acknowledge. So even though you have written a great algorithm, doesn't matter whether it's a machine learning or AI, that does not make you, or that does not make that product higher up into a wisdom category. Wisdom is something which is, again, as I mentioned, rare. It is really related to vision and something that the whole world without doubt acknowledges and appreciates. So it's a rarity. Wisdom is not something that you generally find in business. It's a very rare thing to achieve.
And she said, understood. Great, thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so the reason I spent little bit time here is because often we kind of deal with so many pieces, we are not able to articulate it. And to me, this pyramid is a classic example in terms of, even in the organization, how we can move from just pieces of data to something that is tangible, valuable, and that is always moving up the pyramid. That's the context. I'm not planning to spend a lot of time on the next 4 slides, which essentially go into more mechanics of how each of them are processed. So for example, when I talk about data, there are different data sources. You can have industry, customer data sources, and then there are application systems, internal and external, that deal with the data. When I move to information, it's typically sources, and then the application systems either try to synthesize, they correlate, and then derive the information out of the data. And same way, when we talk about knowledge, it's not just connecting the data, but also finding out what is the common theme, how the decisions can be made with that information, how it gives me the competitive advantage. All those pieces translate into knowledge. And the last but not the least, as I said, wisdom is really rare, and it is something you have perfected the art. So I would kind of say Google is probably reached that wisdom level as far as search is concerned. Now speech recognition is at different levels. I will still call that knowledge, but definitely something which has been perfected. You want to kind of recognize that and move it into the wisdom arena. So these are just the mechanics of these 4 things, but again, everything is related to the pyramid that we talked earlier. Okay, so now we know that there is something called data, something called information. Let's talk very specific in terms of how data gets transformed into information. So again, a big caveat I want to give is this is a perspective. It is not the perspective. So people will have different perspectives, particularly when you interact with your mentors and other system or industry experts. They may give you different interpretation. So you should be open to that. I'm just trying to give you one perspective of this. So data everywhere. I'm sure everybody has seen or heard that term. We fill number of forms, everything collected on web, paper forms. I don't know these days where anybody fills paper forms, but we used to fill them. There is tons of information captured as form of cookies from mobile phones. These are all classic examples of data. And then there is too much of data. No doubt about it. So then, if we have data, what is the differentiator between a data and information? Often there is some kind of process involved, and there is some interpretation. So as I mentioned earlier, it is essentially connecting the dots. So if you have a customer information and if you have a market information, connecting those in terms of supply and demand, and then coming out with what should be your product strategy is something, an example of an information. So you had 2 data points, one related to what customer is interested in buying. You have another data point where those pieces of products or items, inventory may be available, and then somehow you connect those two to say, hey, customer XYZ, buy this product. So again, a crude example, but essentially connecting data points, interpreting them, and transforming it into information. That is what happens in day-to-day life. But that is not sufficient. And why it is not sufficient? Because as you know, when it comes to decision making, they are not looking many times into the granular data. Many decision makers, managers essentially are looking what we often called as a summary data. And what we mean by summary data is either it's an average for all customers, or is it inventory level in a warehouse, those where are the shortages. So as you can see, it's not at the item level, but it is at business constructs which is relevant to those managers. So if a manager is a regional manager, he or she will be looking at it from the region perspective. The region could involve multiple markets, it could involve multiple products, and of course it will be supplying or catering to multiple customers. But the focus for that manager is essentially a region, and that is where the information now starts getting into the summary or aggregate levels. It is often required for reporting. So there are some statutory reporting needs like the SEC, but there are also some optional or nice to have reporting needs. For example, everybody gets a report card at the end of the semester. Now that's a reporting need. We all get a bank statement at the end of the month. That's a reporting need. So reporting need again is at a higher level, and it is, even though it is made up of data, it is specifically constructed to meet those reporting requirements. Now the reason I want to ponder over that is because as we start talking about transforming data into information, I would like to look into these scenarios. And then there are always issues in that process. So when we are transforming data into information, what are some of the things that I will be looking at? Many times, and again, these are just representative things. This is not at all an exhaustive list. So often I will be looking at the ownership. Who owns it? Is it an internal to the organization, external to the organization? Is this information sensitive? Now, we all know there are PII or personal information that needs to be handled very carefully in an organization. Why? Because otherwise the organization would get penalized. Is it a detailed information? Is it a summary information? There are a lot of country rules that also need to be thought through and applied. All these are the consideration about the ownership of the data, what the data means, how it could be handled. Then there is always this quality or metadata related to it. Typical questions are when, where, how, who, where did this data originated, when it was given to that person or organization, why it was given, was it given voluntarily or part of any form. All these are important pieces related, and that's why we call it metadata, related to data and information. And then finally is, at some stage we need to ensure that there is auditability so we can rely on it. Now if it is garbage, you all know the rule, garbage in, garbage out, then hardly anybody can use the information, particularly when we are talking about making strategic or tactical decisions based on this data or information. So somebody needs to have confidence that the information presented is reliable I can act on it, and then there are no U-turns involved. So when we are thinking about the process which transforms data into information, and when we are thinking at the later stage about managing information, all these perspectives kind of become important and relevant. And that is where I wanted to kind of make sure that when we talk about transforming data into information, we have thought through about some of these aspects. Okay, I will again take a pause before I move to the next topic. Any questions?
So far, no question.
Good. Okay, so now we have identified two aspects. One is information is really, really important. Every organization needs it. And then we collect a lot of data, and somehow we have this process of transforming data into information. Obviously, we talked about few considerations that are important or relevant during that stage. One thing starts becoming very clear, that it's not a slam dunk. It's not given to you on a silver platter. Somebody has to manage this information, and that's what we will be talking about, because if you ask me in one sentence, that's all about information architecture. So we are in this information age. Very old times, there was very less written communication. Mostly everybody communicated through verbal means. Then came the books, then came the computers, and then came mobile phones and whatnot. With all this, there is this phenomenal explosion of, and I'm going to use data and information interchangeability, because we all know that at some stage data gets transformed into information. So this explosion of information is what is today's reality. Thanks to all these phenomenons like mobile, cloud, big data, and you name it. So there are at least 5-10 different factors influencing or attributing to that. But with all these things coming in, there is a very simple way of looking at information. And this is where, again, I would, it's an oversimplified purely from the understanding perspective. So data plus context and meaning, and that part is essentially covered by processing, is what is getting data transformed to information. So you can call it connecting the dots, you can call it deriving meaning out of it, or just putting a couple of pieces of data with known or identifiable context. And I will tell you a very simple example. If I just tell you 5 is a data point, but 5 does not communicate anything to you. But when I say 5 is the number of friends which live in Seattle, it means something. When I say 5 hours is how much it takes for me to go from Seattle to New York, it means something. When I say 5 is the number of movies I saw in a year, it means something. So that is the context and meaning related to a data. Again, pardon me for this oversimplistic examples, but I just wanted to drive a point that data is something which is raw facts and figures, but with the light of context and meaning, it gets transformed into this new magical entity called information. So what information architects do, as we can see, information management can fall into a number of these. You have to analyze, you have to plan, you have to organize, design, all sorts of things. related to information, and typically the person or persons who will be doing this are called information architects. Also, from a classic sense, this is where the information architecture um, branch started with. Now, oversimplification, but this is the high level process that typically an information architecture will be following or will use to manage the information. So there is a strategic component to it, lot of planning, lot of thought, because you want to avoid the U-turns. U-turns are very expensive. Also, as we said, when we start talking about information, suddenly now things start becoming relevant. Is I need timely information, I need information to be reaching to the right people, I need reliable information so that when and if I make decisions based on that, then those are going to be the right decisions. So keeping all these in mind, it's virtually a closed loop cycle that you drive to manage the information right from planning stage till you launch a product or launch your company, and then you start even getting feedback about your product or customer experience or any area that you are involved with. That feedback goes back in terms of modifying. So for example, you launch a product and in the initial months the feedback is, well, it's okay, but the price point is high. What do you do with that information? You go back to your planning or strategy sessions, and then you determine whether you are going to increase features in the product or you are going to reduce the price of the product, because you want to be competitive in the market. So every feedback, every piece of information flowing in with the right kind of process in place will result into an action or an inaction. I mean, you can decide to sleep over it, but then there are consequences. So what this illustrates is information is not one time done kind of thing. It is a constant thought, and it is a constant thing in the minds of information architects, and it's a closed loop process that usually results into couple of cycles which will help improve and get to that perfect stage. Because we all have seen that good companies do not want to stop just at the information stage. They want to move up into the knowledge and wisdom area as well. Okay.
So, Shekhar, we have one question.
Okay.
It's from Ben Shi. The question is planning and strategy is the starting point of the process of information architecture in that cycle diagram?
So planning and strategy is definitely one of the starting points, but couple of slides later, I'm going to talk about business architecture. That is where usually the higher level planning and strategy will start. And one of the outcomes of that will be feeding into the information architecture artifacts that we will be talking about. So if you ask me from a pure architecture sense, it's the business architecture which takes care of the planning and strategy, but a direct output of that is what is usually consumed by information architects. And a couple of slides later, I'll be specifically talking about that piece.
Great.
Okay. So here we come to this theme in terms of managing the information, and the theme sounds familiar. It's essentially connecting the dots, right? We have different artifacts, different pieces of the puzzle that needs to be put together. And this is where information architect will start using some tools, either in form of the diagramming tools or in terms of the data dictionary or data depot, and then it will be also interacting with the technology pieces, because again, part of the process is how the information needs to be delivered, and that's where the technology piece will come into play. Again, my objective of this slide is not to talk specifically about whether it's the SOA architecture, XML, or that is irrelevant here. What I'm saying is, at higher level, you will be starting with something called entity model, and then complementing that with metadata and designing your interfaces to make sure that not only you are capturing the relevant information, but how the information is passed on and consumed as well. Again, this is a higher level picture that somebody needs to start drawing. Moving on to the next is, now along with the management of information, we start adding other pieces to the puzzle, and that's where the technology, tools, databases, and whatnot come into the picture. So if I want to just correlate this to our earlier discussion, I start with a 50,000 foot view. I can call this as an entity model, but soon I need to start filling in the gaps and kind of start diving a little lower to 20,000 feet, to 10,000 feet, to 5,000 feet. And that's where all these details need to be plugged in. So it's okay for information architect to give a 50,000 view and leave the details onto others. But then the important piece is everybody else needs to follow that blueprint and needs to ensure that he or she is meeting the requirements. For example, if information architect has defined a web service which says, I will pass on the employee ID and I will get back the salary in dollars. Doesn't matter who implements the web service or whether the web service is implemented in Python or whatever technology. The core, the contract is already decided. And that is what a good information architect will do or is supposed to do, so that at a higher level, he or she can start tying in this in terms of, okay, now I get the salary, how I am going to consume it, how the salary numbers are going to be put together. Is it going to go into a report? Is it going to go into a database? All sorts of things then starts coming to age. But as I mentioned, the information architect is more responsible at the 50,000 foot view, which is essentially a blueprint. Okay, now I'm going to talk about the question that we talked about is, where is this planning and strategy come into picture and how it is related to information architecture? For simplicity's sake, the yellow boxes in the middle is what represents the typical deliverables or artifacts of an information architecture. So whether it's a conceptual data model, logical data model, or physical data model. I'm not saying you require everything. What I'm saying is some representation, and it changes from company to company, it changes from philosophy to philosophy, it changes from tool to tool. But for our practical purposes, these are the three things that we are going to stick to, because at the end you will see this is what we are also expecting from this competition perspective. So now let's start with the light blue area on the left hand side, which I passionately call as business architecture. So business architecture is essentially at a 50,000 foot view of what is my business, what are some of the key business processes that I am involved with. For example, if it is a e-commerce site, so let's take that example. I will have to manage the inventory, I will have to manage the website, and then the customers can come in, log in and buy these products. So at a higher level, that is my business model. Then there are business processes. For example, how the inventory information gets uploaded to your website. And then we talk about business capabilities. For example, will I be selling these products only to US or is it global? Am I going to restrict myself to certain types of products or all products? All these areas are thought through and they become part of the business architecture. How that is articulated again differs, but somebody has to articulate it, whether it's a BRD requirement document or a high level enterprise architecture artifact. Everything is in play. But after the business architecture reaches a certain point and certain clarity, that's when the red arrow kicks in. The red arrow is essentially saying, now I know enough about the business. Let's start talking about the organization of this information. At a 50,000 foot view, that's where your conceptual data model comes into play. It is just related to 4 or 5 core subjects, or if you are familiar with the object word objects that your business will be dealing with. And then once you have the conceptual data model, you start going to the 20,000 foot view, which could be a logical or physical data model view. So I just want to pause. Did that answer the question? Okay, so I hope so. If not, you can have a follow-up questions and we will go into it. Now we are in this information architecture space. Does it stop here? Absolutely not, because on the right hand side you will find something called technical architecture. Now these are the technologists or SMEs who are experts in the technology that we are going to use. These are DBAs. This could be application developers, and these could be the technology architects that are going to really transform the product or how the applications are going to work. But even for them, the input comes from the information architecture, because remember we talked about the contract. So who has defined the contracts is the information architecture, and that's why all this has to play hand in hand, and many times it's an iterative process. So you do reach a certain level, build a prototype, validate that everything is working fine, freeze that, and then move on to the next step. So many of these pieces are often part of an iterative process that an organization goes through, and that is where a true information architect or information architecture plays a very pivotal role in terms of connecting these dots between business and technology. Okay, so I'm going to take a bigger pause, because now we are going to move into the last section, which is, now we have talked enough about this information architecture, transforming data into information. Tell me how it is relevant to the competition that I signed up for. So before I go to that section, I just want to take a quick pause. If there are any questions, let me know. Otherwise, we will move ahead with that section. Okay. No questions. Good.
No question. Yeah.
Yeah. Perfect. No, that's fine. At the end also, we will have enough time. So many of you might have already heard about a term called enterprise architecture. And I just want to kind of state how it is connected to information architecture. So as the enterprises grow over the time, it really becomes difficult to identify what's going on in an enterprise. Also, somebody has to ensure that the left hand knows what right hand is doing, because all these are global organizations. There are so many moving parts, and it really becomes impossible to even visualize what the stuff is going on. So enterprise architecture is that subject area which deals with that space, and it's essentially visioning and documenting things happening at the enterprise place. There are different concepts or different models of enterprise architecture. I just picked one, which is the Zachman framework. You can go to TOGAF, you can go to any other, it's pretty similar. All I wanted to emphasize here is enterprise architecture is that broader spectrum, and if you want, we are just picking one color out of that spectrum, which is the data or information piece. And on the right hand side, you can see that here we have the data, and on the right hand side we have the information. So without going into the details, what I wanted to say is enterprise view is important, but information architecture view plays a big role into this enterprise architecture, and that's why usually information architects and enterprise architects really work together, and it is important for them to work together. Again, we are not going to go into details of enterprise architecture. I just wanted to kind of, again, connect the dots and give that perspective. So as part of this competition packet, you all must have received the information, the templates, and also a checklist. So I'm just going to reiterate and emphasize some of this information, that when you are thinking about the problem space, particularly from this competition perspective, now you should start thinking about what information or what data I need to deal with. Then we will dive deeper into, at logical level, how we can represent it. Are there any reporting or analytical needs? Are there any kind of non-functional like security or volume requirements that need to be accounted for? And then last but not the least is how I want to model this data or information. Now, these are some of the poking questions that I just want to table, because if you start looking into these questions, that will lead you to some of these information architecture artifacts that you will be submitting or you will be working on as part of this competition. So at a higher level, we saw that the data or information needs to be managed. And here I just wanted to give a very high level map of when we talk about entities and when we talk about objects, which are some of these artifacts which are candidates to represent those things. So again, very high level, it's not the kind of this is the truth. There could be differences and people are okay to deviate from their understanding perspective. So one of the deliverables that you will be working on is what is called conceptual model. Don't look at the diagram because I just picked it up from another competition or another deliverable. This may not be applicable to you. But what it says is, again, as you understand the business problem, as you understand the business process, you start thinking about the conceptual model. Am I dealing with customers? Am I dealing with concept called inventory? Am I dealing with concept called pricing? Am I dealing with a concept called warehouse? All these are objects or entities that are relevant to your business now. And conceptual model essentially is that 50,000 foot representation of these concepts, so that when you are explaining it to somebody, uh, this becomes like a handy blueprint, and you say, oh, by the way, this is how you go on the third floor. Oh, we have accounted for, there is going to be a park in front of my building. Conceptual model essentially is that highest level representation which allows you to talk about the way you are doing business, the entities that you are dealing with, and the objects you will be dealing with. So again, very high level, and I don't want to go into the details in terms of arrows and what it means. There are legends, and your mentor will be able to spend substantial time with you in terms of answering some of those specific questions. But conceptual model is usually where you start once your requirements are clear, once your business architecture has reached a certain level, and you start explaining our business process. Then comes the next deliverable, which is called logical model. Now, what is the difference between conceptual model and logical model? Now, a classic example here comes to my mind is when you are dealing with employees. So you know there is a relationship between a manager and an employee. So a manager can have, let's say, up to 5 employees under him or her. But at a higher level, you all know that even managers are employees. So when I think from the logical perspective, employee is an employee is an employee. However, because I create a relationship between, which is a hierarchical relationship between an employee and an employee, I designate some of these employees as managers. So logical model essentially deals with that lowest level or logical concepts that you will be dealing with. At the same time, you start figuring out what are your relationships. Is it, and that's where I want to kind of go into legend a little bit in terms of business rules, whether a customer can place multiple orders, whether a manager can have multiple employees under him or her. Now, there could be a tricky situation. Can an employee report to 2 managers? If that is a business rule you want to implement, represent it, because then implementation is different. So now you can see that you have started moving away from 50,000 foot view and going to that 20,000 foot view when you start talking specifically about the business rules, what you want to implement, how you want to implement, and things like that. That is essentially a representation called logical model. And last but not the least, you will also be dealing with a physical model. Now, what is the difference between a logical model and physical model? A typical thing which is accounted for in this area is the technology which is being used. For example, if I'm going to store data or information in an RDBMS, the technology drives certain constraints. The technology drives certain limitations. And physical model is essentially accounting for those. Example is a many-to-many relationship. There is no way you can represent a many-to-many relationship in a relational database. So what do? You basically create a mapping table which is going to have keys of both the sides, and that mapping table allows you to traverse from one side to another. Now, these are physical limitations and physical asks of the technology which are represented in a physical model. Also, some of the databases will have indexes, so you can represent those, which are the keys. all those things which are driven by technology, if you are using an object technology, maybe instead of tables, physical model will represent objects and the classes. And then are there any subtypes? What are the possibilities? All that is relevant and represented in a physical model. So in nutshell, I just want to go back and kind of quickly recapture this. From this competition perspective, these are the three things you will be focusing on. 50,000 foot view, which is a conceptual model, 20,000 foot view, which is a logical model, and maybe 10,000 foot view, which is a physical model. Now, these are the three artifacts, three deliverables that you will be dealing, I think, in the February timeframe. So, as far as you are concerned, understanding and knowing information architecture from this competition perspective is going to translate into these three deliverables. Okay, now since the competition has already begun, I wish you all the best. As I mentioned, your mentors is your first line of defense. I know you will be reading a lot of this information and then mentors will be guiding you further. However, if you have any questions at a later stage for me, I'll be more than happy to answer them as well.
So we have one more question coming from Ben. The question is, how about the database dictionary? And there's one more question. Do we need to provide it as well?
I think along with the physical model, it's recommended to have data dictionary because data dictionary complements these deliverables. So I would say it's nice to have, but I don't know whether from competition perspective it's a must to have. Rakesh, can you clarify that?
Yeah, we do, yeah, that's an optional. As you said, it's optional.
Yeah,
nice to have.
It's nice to have, but I will tell you, if I was doing the project, I will include that. It doesn't have to be very elaborate. It could be just a one-pager, but it helps you to complement some of these diagrams. So I will encourage it, but again, I can't comment on whether it's a must-have from competition perspective.
I agree. So if anyone has a question, they can type it in question box, or they can raise a hand, then I can unmute, and then you can ask question directly. Anyone? Any question?
Okay, perfect.
Smriti said it was all clear. Great job, Sekhar.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Again, take it with a caveats. It's oversimplification. So real life is much complicated and different. But what I wanted is drive that simple, straightforward conceptual view to you so that you understand where we are coming from.
Absolutely.
Okay, and all the best, everyone.
We have one question from Ben. I'm unmuting her. Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah.
Yes,
so
I
the
can.
Question is, the question is regarding the data requirements in the template you provide. Specifically, it's about the PCI and the PI data classifications, and also the access to the data, and also the regulations like the European Union requirements for the data storage. I mean, can you please give me a short introduction on these kind of concepts and how what I need to do to fulfilling those requirements?
Yeah, so there are some standards which are published, and I know that those standards differ from country to country. So we are not expecting you to go into nth level of detail. However, from your solution perspective, the expectation is yes, you need to identify a PII or personally sensitive data, and what are some of the steps you are going to take to protect it, so that mainly from the security or vulnerability perspective. Those are the things that you should think about. Regarding resources, there are enough resources on the web, and another nice pointer also is your mentor can also share some of these details with you. But the expectation is not to do research, not to spend a lot of time, but just at a higher level, differentiating or distinguishing information into a commonly consumable information and PII or a sensitive information, and then what are some of the things you will do to protect that sensitive information.
Okay. One follow-up question is regarding the data security or protecting the data. As my understanding, one aspect is to secure our data. I mean, maybe use some like strong password like that.
Yeah.
And also like two-factor verification like this. But another one is how about the recovery? I mean, do we need to consider the recovery of the data, even though it is like cloud?
No, you're not expected to have the kind of full-fledged data recovery. However, it will be good to mention that you are going to recommend taking regular backups, and that is your data recovery or data strategy. But the more important information that you may want to do is, example comes to my mind is, you will never pass a simple text across the wires, right? So it needs to be encrypted and decrypted when it is flowing across the web or across the wire. So these are some of the best practices in terms of data security that you need to think through and hopefully implement in your solution.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
No more questions.
And we have two more questions. I'll read the first one. It's from Ankit. The question is physical data model the same as the actual data model used by an enterprise? Does it have to be normalized?
Not necessarily. There are different levels of normalization. Typically, in a physical data model, you will be denormalizing if it is for reporting. If it is for transactional processing, then it will be normalized. So that is another consideration that you will account for. And maybe there are separate data objects or tables, one for transactional processing so that you get the required throughput, and one which is aggregated and summary but at the reporting level. So exactly those are the considerations we want you to think through, again, not into nth level of detail, but at a higher level in terms of what things you will require to support your system.
Thank you. And we have one more question from Shan. I think she's confused, so she's asking a question. She's saying, conceptual model is about the names of entities. Logical model is about the primary key and foreign keys of the entities, and the logical model is more about attributes of entities.
Yeah, so I agree there is some overlap, or there is some confusion between the conceptual model and logical model. Let me try to give you an example. In business world, you have supplier and you also have a customer, right? Both are different concepts, different entities, if you want to view it. But logically, when you think about it, everything can be generalized into a party. A party concept is something which is somebody which is outside my organization, and then that party can play a role of either a supplier or a consumer. This is where when you're dealing with the business concepts, it's a different level of thinking. But when it goes to the logical level, you can play with it. Is it aggregating to the same concept? Logically, can I view all these people in the same bucket? And then lastly, when you start thinking about the physical implementation, you may decide to have a separate table for suppliers, separate table for vendors. These are all kind of considerations that you will be going through. Now, again, from competition perspective, we don't want to overcomplicate these kind of things, but in a real life enterprise scenario, you do consider dealing with these scenarios in detail. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yes, he said.
Yeah, and again, I'm not expecting at end of this session you will be experts in terms of what is conceptual model, what is logical model. I do expect that you as a team will be working, doing research, and then working with your mentor, and then mentor will be guiding you further in these areas. If I want to give a key, focus on business requirements and higher level business process. Once you have understood that, generating a conceptual model becomes really easy.
Okay, we are running out. Yeah, we are a little over the time, but does anyone have any question now?
Okay, thank you,
Then
everyone.
we are good. Thank you, Shekhar.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.